Welcome to Ultimate Ukraine YouTube channel. We all know that Rome wasn't built in a day. Ukraine has shown us the best example of this since February 24, 2022. The Kiev army completely changed the course of the war, especially in the first week of 2023, with critical strategic moves. We have never seen Russia in such a passive position. The architect of this situation, Ukraine, is currently on the Bakhmut front line, continuing to hit the invading Russian army in the heart. Now we are going to Bakhmut, the front line where the hottest and most violent conflicts take place. Once upon a time, the eastern front of Ukraine was the best battleground for Russia. The advantage was in the invading Russian troops. Immediate logistical support was provided from Belgorod and the Kursk region. But over time, the Moscow army used almost 50% of its ammunition reserve on the eastern front line. Bakhmut, on the other hand, was a small city that the Russian army had not been able to occupy for about 6 months. The Russian army suffered the heaviest loss of ammunition and soldiers proportionately in Bakhmut. According to our analyses, independent war analysts, and the data of the Ukrainian General Staff so far, the Russian army lost 20% of all the ammunition it lost on the Eastern Front and nearly 20,000 soldiers in Bakhmut. Compared to Bakhmut's surface area, these losses were enormous. It was almost like a battle to Helm's Deep. When things started to go wrong for the Russians, the basic balances in Bakhmut changed, and this place has now turned into a war bastion of Ukraine. At the moment, breathtaking clashes are still going on in Bakhmut, where black smoke covers the sky, thousands of bullets fly in the air every day, and is the grave of countless soldiers. In this battlefield where the soldiers of the Ukrainian army have mastered, the Russian trenches have begun to be pushed out of the city. The recent attacks by Ukraine in the city turned the 41-kilometer battlefield into hell for the Russians. In Bakhmut, where 20,000 soldiers could fight at the same time, and a new one could join the battlefield instead of each dead soldier, the conditions began to get worse for the soldiers. The dates were showing January 8, 2023. Russia was preparing to attack in a wooded area of Bakhmut to try one last move before the day was out. The sun had already set, and nearly everyone on the battlefield was gathering energy for the next day's fighting. The invading troops launched an attack on the assembly areas of the Ukrainian forces in the direction of Bakhmutska. The purpose of the Russians in this offensive operation was to capture Soledar and provide a better view for the troops trapped in Bakhmut. The soldiers of the Moscow army came under defensive fire from the Ukrainian forces as they passed through Bakhmutska. But the Russians, who managed to shift most of the troops from here to the hills in the city of Soledar, narrowly escaped a great danger. Having a chance to breathe in Soledar, the Russian troops began to force the Ukrainian defense lines after they were well deployed in this region. But the solid shield formed by the Kiev army could not be broken. In addition, Russian troops sought support from their troops in Yakovlivka to break through the defenses of Ukraine. But the Ukrainian forces launched a sudden offensive operation against the invaders in Yakovlivka and liberated the villages in this area. As soon as Yakovlivka fell to the Ukrainians, the Russians had only one chance: massively attacking the defense line of the Kiev army between Soledar and Bakhmutska. The Russian troops were faced with a barrage of fire from Yakovlivka. Especially the Ukrainian forces in Yakovlivka were able to target Russian troops forming fortifications in Soledar from behind. The Russian soldiers were forced to flee towards Bakhmutska due to pressures of the Ukrainian forces. It was reported that Wagner Mercenary Corps was among this group that fled. The soldiers of the Wagner group, hiding in a school in Bakhmutska, were advancing towards the border line of the city in order to be able to participate in the battles of Bakhmut after waiting there for a while. In fact, all the fighting in this area was a rehearsal for a better position and advantage on the Bakhmut front line. Ukrainian and Russian troops were also advancing from the surrounding areas of Bakhmut into the depths of the city. Yesterday, however, the gates of hell were reopened for both sides of the war. In other words, a movement started again in Bakhmut. The Ukrainian army, with 120,000 soldiers, inflicted record losses on Russia in this city. Russia, which has been trying to occupy the city for about 6 months, is putting 70,000 soldiers on the field in Bakhmut alone. However, we cannot say that the number of soldiers is very important for the conflict on the front. As we mentioned, the front can only accommodate 20,000 soldiers. Although this situation seems to be at the disadvantage of Ukraine, there is a great show of strength of Ukraine here. The stage takes 20,000 soldiers, and Ukraine always won at that stage. The redundancy of 120,000 soldiers in numbers may pose a question mark in your mind. However, when Bakhmut is completely liberated, 120,000 Ukrainian soldiers will take action to liberate the entire east. This is a strategy and intelligence war. Despite all this, Russia, as we mentioned, counterattacked again yesterday and launched an attack on the Ukrainian forces with its troops from Bakhmutska. But the invading troops were waiting for a surprise right in the Bakhmut border area. Yes, Russian soldiers advancing from Bakhmutska into the heart of the war were attacking the Ukrainian forces here. But a critical detail that was forgotten brought disaster to the Moscow army. A group of Ukrainian forces had been following the Russian troops from Bakhmutska towards the conflict zone, namely the borderline of Bakhmut from Yakovlivka. As a result, whenever the Russian troops advanced, the Kiev forces, which had been behind the invading troops since Yakovlivka, were advancing to the same extent. The fierce conflict between these two groups in the southwest of Bakhmutska, right in the area we are talking about, added new ones to the number of losses of the Russian army in Bakhmut, turning into a pit of hell. Bakhmut also became the mass grave of the soldiers who died in the conflicts on the surrounding fronts. As a result of the last attack, Russia realized that some things were much more difficult in Bakhmut than before. On this front line, there have been clashes in the forested areas in the last few days. Weather conditions were much worse in this region last week, but the rain a few days ago had softened the ground in Bakhmut. For this reason, both sides of the war could not properly advance their armored vehicles in the region. This situation actually worked very well for the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainian forces outnumbered the invading troops in this city. At least, according to our latest data, this was the numerical situation. With the softening of the ground, forest conflicts also intensified. The battle in Bakhmut, which turned into a full-fledged positional conflict, was further diminished by the Russian leader Vladimir Putin's temporary ceasefire order. Ukraine, on the other hand, claimed that Putin's temporary ceasefire had different purposes. In fact, considering that Russia prevented the humanitarian corridor of the Ukrainians at the beginning of the war and even carried out offensive operations in these areas, it would not be absurd to say that Putin had a different intention in this regard. But no matter what, the Ukrainian armed forces does not seem to make any concessions to the Russians with the dynamic pace it has caught after the new year. In this regard, support to the Kiev army is also very important. In Europe and the USA, the problems with the supply of ammunition are starting to increase, especially these days. But Ukrainians are also feeling the strain. With European stockpiles depleted, most European governments have yet to switch to wartime production to make up for Ukraine's spending on arms and ammunition. Even the United States is beginning to feel it should prioritize. For example, in the case of 155mm howitzer ammunition, the USA provides about 14,000 rounds per month, but reports from Ukraine indicate that his forces fired an average of 5,000 rounds a day. The Pentagon recently announced that it plans to triple production of 20,155mm rounds per month by spring and by 2025. Ukrainian forces need to have military stocks at least twice their daily rate in order to re-attack invading troops and liberate more national territories. And the challenge this year is clear. Will European governments make contracts and spend the money to accelerate the production of ammunition and equipment to meet Ukraine's needs to continue to hinder Russia's advance, and then take the initiative to defeat their power and liberate all the lands of the nation? These possibilities must be entirely in Europe, because as the United States ramps up munitions production, Washington has additional arms commitments to meet, including supply contracts to Taiwan and others. So the burden must fall on Europe. The West, which should lighten the burden on the shoulders of the United States, should support Washington on this matter, whatever it may be. The conflict in Ukraine is a system-changing war, the outcome of which will determine the continent's security for a generation or more. It is time for all European governments, not just those on the eastern border, to understand what is at stake and act accordingly. This war is first and foremost a numbers game. Not the good one, but the crowd wins. Thank you for watching us.